Right. Yeah. And I think something connected to this understanding of will is another idea Nietzsche had, which is he calls it perspectivism or perspective, and how there is no objective reality for Nietzsche.
Right.
There's just different perspectives. And in the
Right.
same way, there's just and that's just because there's a bunch of different wills. We're all just these individual wills. And there it's actually interesting to compare his understanding of the will to an orthodox understanding of the will, because what it means to be divinized is to be because actually another name for the divine energies is the divine wills. This is actually more ancient language than energies. This is a language used by uh Dionysius the Areopagite. And it's like this the divine wills are and are um are all united, and they're all united in the one will of God. And there is this one will of God, which we are meant to, in our wills, be united to. And that lining up our will with the will of God, that
Hmm.
is what deification is. But for
Right.
Nietzsche, there is no lining up of this will. There's just a competition between the different wills. And this literally fractures reality into these multiple different perspectives and these multiple competing um, um like life just becomes a competition. It's like Darwinian evolution. These are all connected ideas, right? And
Right.
I think the last thing I'll say about that is the way Nietzsche describes the will in Thus Spoke Zarathustra is he talks about the metamorphosis of the spirit, the metamorphosis of the will, however you want to understand that. It's a you have the camel, the lion, and then the child. Now, the child he refers to as a self-propelling wheel, and it's like it's the will that affirms itself, and in the face of all struggle, it just affirms itself, and it's this constant affirmation of life. But there is no communion, right? It's just like an internal. He believes there's like this internal power that we can use, and just we can just affirm life without any support from anything transcendent. But actually, when you actually look at this metaphysically, you realize that no, this is impossible. You will eventually exhaust yourself. You are not a self-propelling entity. You are an entity only insofar as you receive your being from God. You are created out of nothingness. That is why naturally every system, even just talking about physics itself, every system loses energy as it moves. So it's the same way with us. We are not these beings of infinite creativity, but with this understanding of will to power, which I just think is a false understanding of what actually the human is capable of. And it's interesting, you actually see that in Nietzsche's life. He had this very lofty philosophy about affirmation of life and all this stuff, but in his life he was clearly a man full of resentment of I mean he was also just a weirdo. He would like
Yeah.
apparently he wrote a love poem for Wagner's wife and then read it in front of Wagner to his wife. It's like
Right.
he was
Well,
just
Nietzsche
yeah.
also proposed to a woman that was having threesomes with him and his friend,
Mm.
and she rejected him like two or three times, and then she left with his friend. And Nietzsche was a weirdo. Nietzsche, and that's why he found his identity. He was gifted intellectually,
Mhm.
and so he found his
Yeah.
identity through his intellect, which then was tied to his will, and sort of, and that's what made him famous of his criticism of Socrates and how he would go through the history of philosophy and have sort of unique critical takes of many people and um, different important philosophers, but he was also a promoter of vitalism. So he was not of the Darwinian school of survival of the fittest. He believed it was a sort of explosion of creativity, and that really the essence of life was creativity. And so, therefore, your will should be sort of performed through creative processes of both creating yourself and creating art and creating all these different things. And that's really the only thing that is worth living for is becoming a sort of ubermensch. Your will, it's not just to dominate people, it's creativity. And that's where, in a way, he was less scornful than, maybe just a pure Darwinianist, because they're not interested in creativity. It's really just about survival of the fittest and power and domination. And if you can, then you deserve to. Whereas
Right.
Nietzsche, I don't think ultimately would disagree with that, but because of his take on what evolution was, he believed evolution was a vitalistic process as opposed to just
Mhm.
a survival process.
Right. Yeah. And I think the crucial point about his ideas about creativity is that from our understanding, creativity is comes from God. Creativity is
Right.
grounded in God,
And that
right?
would be
So,
in one of these uncreated energies that
mhm,
if we're truly creating in a good way, it's going to create more harmony, more
right.
beauty, more truth, more love.
Exactly. Yeah. And without that, you get for one, you get the fracturing, literally a fracturing of reality into these multiple competing perspectives, as Nietzsche calls it.
Mm-hmm.
And you also get, I just think you get, eventually you exhaust that, you exhaust your creative power, and that ultimately ends in, I would say, insanity. And I mean, that's exactly
That's
what,
how he ended.
yeah, that's what happened to Nietzsche himself. Um,